Alright, so, to whom it may concern, we're going to be doing some quick talks about gesture and what it means to draw a gesture, and how to approach gesture drawing as an exercise to improve your overall drawing skills. I've talked about this before, and I keep redoing it because it's, constantly a struggle for everybody, even people who are good at it. I've got a couple of books here that I'm going to be referencing in between the exercises, one of which is obviously the Vilpu Drawing Manual, sort of the Magna Carta on drawing, in my opinion. And then as well, I also have Force here because this one is intentionally cryptic in my mind. However, as a visual tool for comparison, it's pretty much unparalleled. Right? Like, there is... While for guiding practical instruction in gesture drawing and figure drawing as a whole, it's not great, much like, Frank Cho's book on drawing women. The actual examples in there are a good sort of benchmark to place your work up against to see if you're getting that level of dynamicism that you want. I'm going to be working primarily with clothed models just to keep this safe for YouTube, so I may have to skip through them for a while. And I'm also going to be using longer time limits so I have time to go into the concepts that I want to go over. The very last resource that's on offer here, which I can include a link in the description for a download if anybody wants it, is Yo Yoshinari's sketchbook. He's an animator for, if I'm not mistaken, Studio Trigger, and his sketchbooks are pretty fantastic. He does these, as you can see, on usually animation paper, hence the holes. Usually in pencil, though I believe there is some pen stuff in here as well. And he covers lots of different topics, because it's more personal expression than instruction, but there is a lot of useful things here, stuff like, for example, how he poses figures and how things come together. Even though he goes with this very 2D graphical cartoony style, right, everything is very stylized. If you look, for example, these ones here, he's very clearly drawing through. There is always a sense of weight and form to his drawings, even when there is no actual volumes being depicted. Because you can tell with the other pieces that he works on where he does depict them, or he at least depicts them in part, that he's considering them when he draws. He's drawing the arm underneath the one here, the legs as they overlap, things of that nature. And that concept neatly tailed into the first thing that I want to look at, which is how to approach understanding the figure. And this can be applied to any topic, if you want to do animals, if you want to do character designs, if you want to do even mechanical designs. Understanding the object that you're drawing, as you can see here, mechanical stuff, is important. Now, this doesn't apply so well, obviously, to something like landscapes, or even really portraiture, but for depicting an object in 3D space, it's a fundamental concept. So, given that, what is it and how do we do it? Well, the way Vilpu talks about it, he very explicitly leaves out bits of information as he goes through. The first chapter you will be doing these sloopy-whoopy line things that everybody thinks of as gesture, right? You have some lines that vaguely depict an action, and then you build up on that. And the way Vilpu decides he wants his students to approach it, and the way that many traditional artists, Renaissance artists did it, is the same way. This is the step that gives people the most trouble because they stop here, right? You get this part to an okay level, you do the exercises, and then you realize, oh my god, I can't do anything else. How am I supposed to improve? That's why going through all of these chapters in order is important. So for example, this right here, it is purely a 2D abstraction. There is nothing really 3D about this here, and I believe he mentions that somewhere in this section. But the idea is to create a 2D abstraction with consideration to 3D as you do it, that you can then build upon. So, for example, let's take this little model here. You got the circle, the dot for the head, a surrounding line to indicate some form, the neck shape, the back shape, and as this pulls forward. Now, on its own, this isn't very helpful, but if you're thinking in 3D volumes, you can... What I like to do is I like to wrap the rubber bands up around it, the contour lines over the surface. And when you start approaching it like that, you can sort of make a logical deduction. Okay, if this is a 3D form, where is there going to be a pinch? Is this side going to be pinching, or is this side going to be pinching? Obviously it's going to be this side, so there's going to be a bit of a pinch there, which he goes into in the very next section, as you can see here. And so the idea, as you can see in all of these, he indicates a pinch. There's one here, there's one here. For this one, he leaves it out, but it would be occurring here. Likewise in this one on this side here, he draws that through the arm. These features of the drawing allow you to take an initially abstract 2D concept and start to give it, you know, some depth and some flesh. So obviously, most of you have done this first chunk of the book, even if you didn't do it from this book. But the problem arises where you see these, right? These are what you've been doing, stuff like this. And he then starts drawing these without really explaining how he gets there. And he goes into this in his videos, and it's sort of a similar thing as to what Michael Matesi goes into in his Forced book. And that's what we're going to start with on our end. We're going to take the existing 2D graphical representation of the motion of a picture and figure out how do we find that in a picture we've never seen before, how do we develop our skills on finding that and representing it with our line, and then how do we use that to move forward onto greater things. And so for that we're going to pull a model here. And one of the main things Vilku talks about in his book, or in the videos that's in the book but not handled appropriately in my opinion, is that it is the gesture of the eye. You are leading the eye, which is why you don't always need to start with the head. So for example, we'll take this circle, and this is my first drawing for the past few days, so I'm a little bit rusty, but right, this is fairly clearly the tilt of the head. It's a little bit exaggerated for what's going on there, but a little dot for the top, a little cross contour line there. And if you're following other gestures, you may be tempted to either find this line of action here, which I don't think is very good, or you may be tempted to do as Vilpu does, pull this out into the neck and then draw the spine as it comes around, and then pull this forward into the leg. But that's not super helpful. While it is nice to work off of the spine as a major mass, as a beginner, one of the things that you need to consider is how all of the pieces fit together. How the spine fits into this is somewhat unclear, and so the way I like to approach it is leading the eye. So when I look on this picture, I start at the head, I follow down in this direction, and then for me personally, I hit here, and then I curve around to here. So for my gesture, I'll be doing something that effectively guides the eye to those points in that way. Alright, so you'll take the hip here, this line down, and then this long curve as it pulls back. And then for the arms, I generally add those in later after I've positioned the mass of the torso, which we'll get into in a moment. But basically speaking, when you have this scaffolding, you then need to give it some form by applying, well, 3D forms. And you can do that by drawing through and adjusting your gesture as you go. So for example, if we really simplify the form of the chest cavity, it looks something like this. Right, it's got this line facing forward giving you the direction. The chest is pointing up and out. And thus the hips, they're pointing only a little bit down, because there's really not that much mobility unless you're a contortionist. And so, the next shape I need to do, it would be this one here. The volume for this portion of the hips. So everything that's basically not attached to the rib cage, and there will be mobility in this space, because that's where the guts are, and they're not rigid like the spine is. And so the second step that I'll go into just after this one is using square forms. So in this case, I simplified the chest to basically just an egg, but this has a pretty clear square, a pretty clear corner is what Vilpu calls it. The idea of a point where there is such a steep change in the planes that light will create a delineation, and you can use that as a landmark for orienting this in space, right? It's fairly clear with this that if I were to separate it from the forms of like the leg, the soft human forms, that could be represented as sort of a box in perspective like this. this is the shape that's being represented. And we all know how to light a shape like this. You know, if light's coming from the top, this side's dark. Just from the front, this side's dark. You know, fairly simple stuff. And with that consideration, now that at least personally, now that I have these two major masses in a place that works for me, I will set about using marks that give me information on the rest of the features. Personally, I struggle with limbs, so I like to very much simplify them into rigid tubular bodies, and then go back over that and try to make them fit together in a biomechanical sort of way, in a way that looks like it's organic and not just a bunch of tubes stapled together. And that, which I will touch on in a minute as well, I'm going to actually notate this so I don't forget, that is done with T-lines, or terminating lines. But given this, this is an approach to mapping out the figure and then giving it some form. So what I'm doing on this leg here, now we take the contour and we create a contour based on the volume that was set out earlier, right? And I'm using a little bit of my anatomy knowledge to get this placed the way I want it. The anatomy knowledge isn't perfect because I'm not great at anatomy, but doing so, you know, having that fundamental level of anatomy knowledge, just the basic amount that you get from being a human that sees other humans, will be enough to get you a rough approximation of your shapes. When the main thing here was capturing that particular, the main motion of the torso and the forelimbs, so specifically this portion of the leg and this portion of the arm, capturing these in a convincing way becomes easier once the torso is in place. And so what we're going to be primarily focusing on is chapters 1, 2, and 3 of the Bilfu Drawing Manual. Gesture, soft forms, hard forms, and using them together. Alright? So let's go back to the book real quick. The way you can approach gesture on its own is something that you're going to have to discover. Some people, some people prefer certain things. You look at cartoonists and they like to do, for example, a leg that looks something like this, right? Very straight, very dynamic on that one side. And then, or maybe they'll have it reversed and do something like this for the leg. But all that really matters is that your shapes have a sense of composition to them, right? That you take a pose and consider how the elements are composed against each other in the simplest way possible, and then use appealing 2D shapes to provide that story and a scaffolding for you to flesh out further in the future. So, given that, how can we step into the fleshing out? Because anybody can doodle anything, right? A stick man is not hard, and technically speaking, a stick man is a valid scaffolding for building up on. It's just rigid and boring and lifeless. So how do we go beyond how do we make an initial gesture that works and then take that beyond stickman? And for me personally, I've found that the secret to doing that is gesturing with spherical forms. Gesturing with spherical forms. Alright? So how are we going to gesture with spherical forms? Well, that's the point of these exercises here. The idea of taking these soft forms and overlapping them in such a way that there is a clear sense of depth and form to them. Because spherical forms lend themselves really nicely to encompassing your gesture. Well, what do I mean by that? How are we going to do that? Let's take another example to try. This one's good. So, in this one here, as a beginner, there's a really clear line of action. We can all see it. It's this big vertical shape. However, it's not a linear shape. It is a dynamic, curvy shape that I want to push the boundaries of. And in this case, I feel like I might work from feet to head. And so the first thing I really notice is this curve here that comes out into the hips and then gets met on the outside as this turns inward, and then the direction of the chest as it pushes out, much like this other model was, and how that plays into the tilt of the head. So this is heavily abstracted, but what I did was I sort of traced a path that my eye follows when I see this picture. So when I looked at it, my eye did not go straight up to this arm. I don't think that's a relevant, an initially relevant shape. I thought that this big curve was more interesting, and I wanted to push that. But once the basis is in, next you set up some landmarks, either for reals by marking the paper, or you opt to visualize them and put in the missing shape information. So in this case here, I'm really pushing the twist on this leg, on this arm, and then I will add in the secondary arm now that I've got the rest of this in a place where I want it. And so now we have a really loose and unhelpful gesture. So how are we going to take this and flesh it out? Pretty straightforward. With the head already being a sphere, because that is the easiest thing to mark in as a sphere, you now have a reference point to put in the rest of the forms. And the way I like to approach it, and the way Vilppu talks about approaching it, is this same exercise, right? What I'm doing here with these spherical forms and how they interlocked is literally this chapter exercise. It's this. We're taking the happening, the thing that's on the page in front of us, simplifying it into just a couple of eggs overlapping each other, and trying to get the approximate proportions and orientation in space of those eggs correctly. And this is another model that dovetails really nicely into Lesson 3 box forms, because while this is helpful, this gives you good, squash and stretch information, it all looks hella dynamic and all that shit, it doesn't really help you with your orientation. But this line here, as we all know, that is the that's the anterior superior iliac spine. You don't have to memorize that, but we all know, that sexy little hip bone thingy that happens, and it's mirrored on the other side because the bones are symmetrical. So this gives me a squared off landmark that I can use in reference to adding lighting and deciding how I want the rest of these tertiary forms to interlock on here. And now I'm going to analyze the model a little bit visually for 2D information. The 2D information is, how does this fit in? How does this leg attach to the body? Well, what we can see here, there's this little curve, and that creates a T line, which I guess now is a good time to touch on it, that will give me this little section here very discreetly places this leg in front of the backside of this person's torso. We now know that they are twisting in this direction because we have something in this spot and then something in front of it closer to us. We now have orientation. And next, as far as the legs go, you could get really detailed with the anatomy, or you could just simplify it to these 3D forms interlocking. This leg coming down, its little ball for the knee. I like to do sort of this sort of like vase shape for the calf. I just think it looks appealing when I'm quick sketching. And the other thing, the next thing when building 3D forms with this, is we can tell by looking at this picture that this person's left knee, so the knee on this side here, is actually in front of this leg. And at least that's what I take away by looking at it. So in that case, I'm going to want to make sure that my leg on this side looks like it's coming forward more before it goes back and the foot gets placed. So doing things like this will allow you to take your 2D picture or even just a 3D model and analyze it in such a way that you can build a useful scaffolding from it, a useful image. The human body can do some weird things, so it can sometimes be difficult to get the shapes right, but as a whole, if the gesture is dynamic and makes sense, and the proportions are at least approximately what they should be, it'll help you build confidence in quick sketching, and you will develop, better gestures and more accurate proportions the more you do them from a model. the main thing is overcoming that sort of workflow paralyzation, the how do I even approach this subject? It's so complex, it's so difficult. So overcoming that with these steps is how you go from knowing nothing about a subject to being able to accurately study from a subject. Because what we're doing, these exercises of taking the model and drawing it like this and analyzing features that we think are appealing and want to stress is something that professionals will continue to do. You never stop doing this. You just get better at it and pick up new things, because you're not going to be able to store it all in your memory just immediately. So, now, time to talk about T-lines just briefly. T-lines are these. T-lines are the overlapping lines that occur when you use spherical forms. He talks about it here. The overlapping these 2D representations is a great way to create a sense of form in existing space. Basically, you take a sphere and you take another sphere, and they have intersections of lines that look kind of like the letter T. You can see it's a T, and depending on how you erase them, how you let those apply, that will give you your form. So if I decide that I want this one to come up over the top and this one to stay on the bottom, well, now we know that this form, at the very least, even if it has to be at some point closer to us, sphere A has to be closer to us than sphere B, even though they are technically one object. There's no breaks, this is one large shape. This implied break here lets us know that one object is in front of the other. And this second step here is going to be the most groundbreaking thing for you. If you can already do these little 2D graphical abstractions, you'll be able to take them and build them up. So how can we do that? How can we practice this going from I can barely draw a noodle man to I can draw a clay man? Right? Noodle man to clay man is what we're doing. Well, let's draw the most abstracted noodle man I can think of, or at least something that is very clearly not containing a ton of form. So for me personally, I find that this pose, where you see the shoulder coming forward, the head looking backward, and then the spine curving like this, I find that to be attractive. Right? We can sort of make this out as the silhouette of a person with their butt here. So, how are we going to take this and flesh this out into something that's got some 3D form that isn't just some noodly lines? Well, the first one is to pick the major land masses, in this case, the rib cage, the volume of the rib cage, and we'll add in the arms later, and then the volume of the hips. And I'll erase that so we can simplify the hips. So now we have two overlapping 2D shapes. So to make them 3D, we do our little trick here, and we create some overlap. Right, so something like this here is overlapping, and in this case for the arm, you get an overlap here. This line comes up and gets overlapped by this other shape. And so even though we haven't really given any form to it, we've now placed on the paper some marks that we can reasonably assume have some relationship in space. So the next step to that is obviously making the actual shapes themselves make more sense with anatomy. So the anterior superior iliac spine, the buttock, if I wanted to, I could illustrate like some underwear to give that wrapping form, help clarify the shape. Alternatively, you could go with something like the squishing of the soft form by the leg to clarify the shape. But either way, the end effect is the same, that now these shapes very clearly have one in front of the other. You have this sphere, and this sphere, and this one is in front. So once again, I'm going to give this a little more detail than I normally would for YouTube, for the purposes of illustrating that this leg here, in all of its dotted line glory, this is our form B, and this buttock here in the way that it overlaps is our form A, and we decided that form B is closer to us, and thus it's going to be overlapping with form A in some point, and I chose here. And you can have more points where that overlaps, but the one that I chose is just a preference, but it indicates very clearly that this simplified mass of the leg overlaps this simplified mass of the pelvis. And we'll do the same thing up here. So the if we take the entire, actually what I'll do is I'll duplicate the both of these and pull them over here so we can work with them easier. That way we can work on the same actual sheet. So if we're to take the simplified form of the pelvis, which looks something like this, you know, a sort of squarey form. Now here's the bottom, here's a side plane, and then the simplified mass of the ribs, which are connected by the spine. What we know about anatomy is these two aren't actually going to overlap in a pose like this, so we will have to sort of fabricate an overlap with this here. This is where I'm opting to fabricate the overlap. This little T, if I turn it upside down and zoom in on it, as you can see it's clearly a T, gives us the shape, or gives us the relation of these two major forms, the pelvis and the and the torso. So in this case now we can label this as shape B with its little dotted lines here, and shape A up here for the torso. And it's this concept, being able to apply this to your 2D abstractions, that will get you rolling with your gesture. This is something I have yet to talk about in a video prior to this one. But it's thinking like this that'll take you from noodlemen to claymen. And you can see a similar thing occurring in Mike Matesi's work, right? He doesn't talk about these concepts because he just assumed that you've had enough drawing experience to know it, but if you look at how he initially talks about it, he'll talk about the 2D line and its graphical qualities, and then taking that 2D line and using it to accurately represent the pose of a person. This lovely little straight here of the leg, the missing information, is enough because you can see by these little surrounding marks that he's thinking of these as 3D masses and not just as the 2D lines. The problem is, as somebody who has a good grasp of drawing in 3D, he's now working backwards thinking, how can I improve my 2D appeal? So he leaves a lot of this information out from the viewer. And look at all of the terminating lines he uses in this just to show these forms interlocking in a flowing manner. And so for us, for our purposes, that means the practical thing to do is to take a simplified 2D shape and practice building 3D scaffolding on it. So I'm going to do this one more time, but before I do, I'm going to briefly talk about some more nuances to my noodlemen and how I approach them, and then we'll do one final gesture drawing, and then this will be over. And so the nuance that I wanted to talk about is another thing that I picked up from copying Vilpu, which is enclosing the contour. So for example, look at this shape here, and I'll actually pull a copy of it over onto the drawing surface we got here, so that way we can work with it. If you look at that very clearly, this is a contour, right? Like these shapes, you have a clear bounding box on the figure. So what gives? What's going on? And what ends up giving is that you do both at the same time. We talk about simply the linear visual pattern first to give you something to consider, but obviously that's not how we view the world. And so when you're working from a model, and I'll try to find a more dynamic model than this one. Yeah, that one works. When you're working from a model, you can start with that visual information that sort of follows down the hair, and then a curve over, and then a really sharp retread with the hip. And for me, that follows down into this leg. and this other leg is a tertiary opposing action. And then this arm here is its own shape. And now that this is in place, what you'll end up doing is enclosing the form, limiting where it is and where it isn't. You don't have to do it, but effectively you're taking it, this is one edge, so where's the other edge going to be? Well, the other edge of this form is going to be here. And this leg here is going forward, so if this is one edge for it, the other edge is going to be on this side. And so with this, we sort of have a little visual map, and we can start applying the forms that we're thinking about. I've been doing this a lot, so at this point I don't like to really draw the forms. I like to visualize them and put them in, and I only really draw them in when I've got a problem to solve, which, to be fair, is quite frequently. But like, for example, I'm not going to have to draw the mass of the torso and then the shoulder to get the idea that the shoulder is going to be overlapped. There's going to be this T line here. And in this case, the shape of the pants provides a neat little sort of surrounding line here that means that I don't really need to draw my own rubber band around the form, so to speak. And in this case here, I also see that it looks like her spine is doing this, so I really want to push that with the downward shape of the shirt on this side and with the backwards tilt of the head, these opposing forces that I'm sort of trying to push in one direction. And then that last thing here that I'm doing that I'm not really talking about as much is personal 2D aesthetic choices that come from practicing against other artists and just drawing what you like, stuff that you think looks neat. I really like the look of the way the fabric is stretching like this. I think that's really cool, so I'm drawing that in, even though it has nothing to do with what we talked to. It's my way of sort of having fun with the work, having fun with the homework. And then the last thing here that I want to touch on, and then we'll be done for reals, I swear, is interlocking forms. And this is something that gets talked about a lot by Michael Matesi, more so than Bilpu. But effectively speaking, instead of a tube for this arm, because I think that's going to look boring and crap, what you can do is you can have the arm have the flowing anatomy information here as it wraps, as things link together, and then define those into shapes afterwards with a light eraser, just knock it back. And thinking, I don't really need all this information, I just need that pivotal shape and maybe a terminating line to show the forms. They come together on their own without too much help from me, so I don't need to leave those forms in. It looks more clunky and more artificial than I would have liked, but that marking them in briefly helped me get a contour that I'm happy with. And we'll touch on hands at a later date, because for these quick sketches I always just do quick, lazy origami hands. They give me the gesture that I want, and I mean like the actual hand gesture, not this abstract concept gesture in art. They give me a gesture that I want that can help tie a pose from half-baked to at least 3/4 of the way baked. And yeah, so with all that, I believe I touched on everything that I intended to today. Here is our little sketch worksheet, and I hope this was helpful to some of you. And if it was, thanks for stopping by. Let me know, and I'll try to talk about more stuff in the future.